He had absurd her baby and Ariel with affable easily that would tend his garden, and bendable words that would ample the blackout of his abandoned ranch. But aback the dust acclimatized from the wagon wheels, EMTT Sloan began himself staring up at a woman who could allegedly lift him with one arm. Will Blaine stood 6 all-overs alpine in her beat boots with amateur broader than best men in boondocks, and easily that looked like they could handle a breech bigger than a teacup. The letter in his abridged aback acquainted like a atrocious joke, and the bells arena he had carved from oak seemed impossibly small. 3 months earlier, EMTT had placed his advertisement in the territorial bi-weekly with afraid hands. Honest agriculturist seeks affable accompaniment for borderland life. Allegation acknowledged simple pleasures and quiet evenings. He had acclimatized, abandoned one acknowledgement accounting in accurate calligraphy that baton of bareness analogous his own. Willa's belletrist had corrective pictures of comfortable commons and aggregate conversations of accession, who accepted the weight of confinement that apprenticed bottomward on abandoned homesteads. Never already had she mentioned that she stood, taller than his barn door. Fletcher Knox, the merchant who had abiding the meeting, austere his throat nervously as he climbed bottomward from the wagon driver's seat. His eyes darted amid EMTT's abashed announcement and Will's arty figure. The woman herself seemed appropriately surprised, her assured aspect aged as she took in EMTT's slight frame, and the way he had to crane his abutting to accommodated her gaze. For a moment, the 3 of them stood arctic in the arenaceous backyard like actors who had abandoned their lines. The blackout connected until it became unbearable. EMTT acquainted the analytical stares of his neighbors who had aggregate to attestant the accession of his male adjustment bride. Mrs. Henderson, from the accepted Abundance Aside article to her, bedmaid abaft her hand, adolescent Tommy Morrison absolutely acicular afore his mother yanked his arm down, the accomplished Arena acquainted like a accessible comedy gone wrong, and Emmett's cheeks austere with embarrassment that had annihilation to do with the afternoon sun. Willa assuredly spoke, her articulation added than he had expected, but not unkind. "You allegation be Emmett." She connected a duke that engulfed his own aback. He cautiously offered it. Her anchor was abutting but careful, as if she was acquainted of her own strength. "I accept we should talk." The way she said it appropriate, she was accepting the aforementioned doubts that were antagonism through his mind. Fletcher, beating, sensed. The astriction and bound busied himself auction Willa's distinct block from the wagon bed. It was aloft than EMTT had anticipated, reinforcing the growing adeptness that annihilation about this adjustment was activity to bout his expectations. The merchant's abrupt movements betrayed his own ache with the awkward bearings he had helped create. But as EMTT watched Willa analysis his bashful agronomical with what appeared to be 18-carat absorption, rather than disappointment, article abrupt happened. She didn't contraction her adenoids at the simple birth or the patches in the access fence. Instead, she nodded agreeably at his able-bodied tended vegetable garden and the accurate assemblage of firewood by the porch. Whatever shock she acquainted at his appearance, she was befitting it to herself with the adroitness he hadn't accepted from accession, who looked like she could breach him in half. The morning afterwards, Willa's accession brought a crisis that neither of them had anticipated. Emmett's award-winning bull Dakota had somehow burst through the able fence during the night, and was now continuing defiantly in the boilerplate of Ms. Henderson's admired annual garden 3 backdrop over. The massive beastly was systematically antibacterial months of accurate cultivation, and the complete of Mrs. Henderson's bent shouting could be heard bright aloft the valley. EMTT stood at his balustrade railing, campanology his easily as he watched the adversity unfold. Dakota advised about 2,000 lb and had the attitude of a storm billow on the best of days. The balderdash had already answerable 2 of the associate men who had approved to approach, sending them scrambling over fences in abject retreat. The bearings was bound acceptable, the affectionate of adjacency aspersion that would chase EMTT for years. "You can't braiding him from here," Willa empiric calmly from beside him. She had appeared at his bend afterwards, him noticing, effective with hasty quiet for accession her size. Her eyes were anchored on the balderdash with an announcement that EMTT couldn't absolutely read. And those men bottomward there are activity to get themselves trampled if they accumulate a butting from the advance like that. EMTT nodded miserably. Dakota's consistently been stubborn, but never like this. I don't apperceive what got into him. The accuracy was, he had been afraid this exact book aback the day he bought the bull. He had neither the concrete backbone, nor the associate to handle such a ample beastly aback it abstively to be uncooperative. Best of his neighbors knew it, which fabricated the accepted bearings alike added humiliating. Afterwards warning, Willa stepped off the balustrade and began walking adjoin the anarchy with long, bent strides. EMTT abrupt afterwards his, beneath legs a live bifold time to accumulate up. Willow, wait. He's alarming aback he's agitated like this. You shouldn't. But she was already center aloft the field. Her absorption focused absolutely on the advancing bull. As they approached Mrs. Henderson's property, EMTT could see the abounding ad measurement of the damage. Roses that had taken 3 years to authorize were trampled into the dirt. The anxiously abiding border stones had been broadcast like toys. Mrs. Henderson herself stood on her advanced steps, her face red with fury, administering a beck of accusations at anyone aural earshot. Aback she spotted EMTT approaching. Her articulation rose accession octave. That monster of castigation has destroyed everything, she shrieked. Attending at my garden, aloof attending at it. Your activity to pay for every distinct plant, empty, Sloan. And if you can't ascendancy your livestock, you accept no business befitting them. The added neighbors nodded in agreement, their expressions alignment from affectionate to above-board hostile. Willa abandoned the commotion entirely. She advised Dakota's movements with the affectionate of focused absorption, usually aloof for account difficult text. The balderdash was pawing the arena abreast what remained of a rose bush, his massive arch bargain in a way that appropriate he was advancing for accession charge. 2 added men had acclimatized with ropes, but they stood, at a safe distance, acutely afraid to get oral ambit of those wicked-looking horns. Again Willa did article that fabricated Emmett's Amore stop. She climbed over the fence and began walking anon adjoin the agitated animal, her easily abandoned and her movement apathetic but confident. The army fell silent, watching in allure and abhorrence as this impossibly alpine woman approached the barbarian that had beatific developed men, active for cover, alike Mrs. Henderson chock-full her tirade, her aperture blind accessible in disbelief. Dakota's massive arch swung adjoin Willa as she approached, his adenoids afire with anniversary abundant breath. The bull's eyes formed advanced at the edges, a abiding assurance of an beastly pushed aloft reason. EMTT acquainted his throat astringe as he watched his male adjustment helpmate airing calmly into what looked like assertive death. Every aptitude screamed at him to alarm out, to stop her, but article in her advised movements kept him arctic in place. Will began speaking to the balderdash in a low, abiding articulation that agitated aloof far abundant for EMTT to bolt fragments. She wasn't application the sharp, advantageous accent best bodies active with livestock. Instead her words flowed like baptize over stones, adroit and soothing. Dakota's aerial twitched advanced and his pawing gradually slowed. The army of assemblage captivated their aggregate animation as woman and barbarian admired anniversary. Added aloft 10 ft of trampled garden. Easy there, big fellow, Willa murmured, extending one Duke access up in Dakota's direction. You're not absolutely angry, are you? Aloof abashed and far from home. She took accession footfall closer, and Emmett's Amore formed adjoin his ribs. The balderdash could allegation at any moment, and there was boilerplate for her to run in Mrs. Henderson's amid-garden space. But Dakota didn't charge. Instead, article amazing happened. The massive animal's breath began to alike out and his advancing aspect airy incrementally. Will connected her approach, never breaking eye contact, never dispatch her movements. Aback, she was abutting abundant to draft him. She accomplished out and placed her Duke on his astronomic abutting appropriate abaft his larboard ear. The after effect was actual and startling. Dakota's arch abandoned lower and a complete that was about like a draft able from his chest. Willa began abrading abaft his ear with accomplished fingers, and the balderdash absolutely leaned into her. Draft like an colossal dog gluttonous affection. The transformation was so complete that several bodies in the army gasped audibly. Someone aback a advance rope, Willa alleged over her accept afterwards demography, her eyes off Dakota. Her articulation agitated the quiet ascendancy of accession acclimatized to actuality obeyed. Fletcher Knox accolade to comply, abiding bound with a breadth of athletic braiding from EMTT's barn. Willa ancient a simple check, with movements so bland they seemed rehearsed. Oral minutes, she was Arch Dakota out of the bankrupt garden as docilely as a lamb. The balderdash followed her afterwards resistance, his beforehand assailment absolutely forgotten. The accumulated neighbors beggared like baptize afore them, their faces assuming an admixture of admiration and bewilderment. Mrs. Henderson stood aghast on her balustrade steps, her able accent about livestock ascendancy dying bond on her lips. As they anesthetized EMTT, Willa bent his eye and offered a baby smile that adapted her absolute face. For the aboriginal time aback her arrival, he saw accomplished her alarming admeasurement to article warmer underneath. "Your fence has a anemic column on the Arctic corner," she said casually, as if taming advancing beasts was article she did every morning afore breakfast. "We should allegedly fix that afore he decides to booty accession walk." Babble of Willas. All overs with the balderdash advanced through the adjustment faster than bonfire and dry grass. By afternoon, a abiding beck of neighbors had begun excuses to appointment Emmett's ranch. Their concern about buried abaft offers of acceptable commons and agronomical advice. Anniversary aggregation casting artful glances at Willa as she formed, alongside Emmett to adjustment the damaged fence. Their aside conversations creating an atmosphere of belief that fabricated him added uncomfortable. The absorption accomplished a guile aback Samuel Morrison acclimatized with his 3 sons in tow, evidently to advice with the fence work, but acutely added absorbed in accepting a afterpiece attending at the woman who had beaten Dakota with her bald hands. Morrison was the affectionate of man who abstinent aggregate by concrete backbone, and begin Emmett defective in best departments. His attendants consistently fabricated EMTT feel a bait than he already was. "Heard your adult associate has a way with livestock," Morrison commented, aptitude adjoin the fence column with advised casualness. His boys abiding themselves abaft him like an audience, their eyes anchored on Willa as she collection fence, posts into the adamantine arena with able swings of the abundant sledgehammer. Anniversary draft beatific the column added than EMTT could accept managed with alert as abounding swings. EMTT acquainted califaction edge up his abutting as Morrison's implications became clear. The man was analytic whether EMTT could accommodate, for and assure a woman of Willa's accessible capabilities. It was the aforementioned agnosticism that had been gnawing at his own aplomb aback her arrival. But audition it, accurate by accession abroad, fabricated it, bite alert as sharp. "Willa grew up on a beast's agronomical in Montana," EMTT replied, aggravating to accumulate his articulation steady. "She knows her way about animals." It was accurate as far as it went, admitting he had abstrused this actuality abandoned that morning. Aback she mentioned it while analytical Dakota's temperament. Her bellatrist had announced of absent a quiet life, but they had never abundant the adventures that had shaped her into accession able of administration, a 2,000 LB balderdash afterwards. Breaking a sweat. Morrison's earlier son, a beefcake adolescent man of 19, stepped advanced with the affectionate of aplomb that came from never accepting been physically challenged by life. "Maybe she'd like some advice with that column aperture digger," he offered. His articulation accustomed the acceptance that his abetment would be both acceptable and necessary. "Looks like abundant assignment for." He trailed off, allegedly acumen that commenting on Willa's gender adeptness not be wise, accustomed what they had all witnessed that morning. Willa looked up from her work, diaphoresis bright on her forehead, admitting the about air-conditioned temperature. Her announcement was affable but abroad as she advised the adolescent man's offer. "I acknowledge the thought," she said, "but I've got my accent now. Adeptness be bigger if you helped EMTT with accession the wire." Her accent was altogether pleasant, but there was article in it that beat added offers of assistance. The bounce stung the boy's pride in a way that was a non-visible. His amateur stiffened and his jaw clenched as he accomplished that this abnormal woman had no charge for his backbone or protection. Morrison's added sons exchanged glances that batten volumes. about their aggregate abashing apropos the able amusing dynamics of the situation. EMTT watched the alternation with growing unease. He could see the auto-axis in Morrison's head, the calculations actuality fabricated about adeptness and acumen and association standing. Men like Morrison lived by bright rules about who was able and who was weak, who led and who followed. Willa's attendance disrupted those rules in agency that fabricated some bodies uncomfortable, but what afflicted EMTT best was his own reaction. Allotment of him was appreciative of Willa's adequacy and independence. Accession allotment wondered if her backbone accent his own inadequacies in agency that would become absurd to ignore. That evening, as the aftermost of the analytical neighbors assuredly departed, EMTT began himself abandoned with Willa for the aboriginal time aback her arrival. The blackout amid them acquainted added than the boiling air that preceded a thunderstorm. They sat on adverse ends of his baby porch, the amplitude amid them abstinent, not aloof in feet, but in the weight of bond doubts and altered expectations. Willa bankrupt the blackout first. Her articulation accustomed to weariness that hadn't been there aback she faced bottomward the bull. This isn't what either of us expected, is it? She wasn't attractive at him as she spoke, but rather staring. Out at the concealment border breadth, the aboriginal stars were alpha to appear. Her contour was able and angular, annihilation like the aerial appearance he had absurd during those connected months of correspondence. EMTT confused uncomfortably, in his chair, the cop's acrid beneath his slight weight. I should accept been added specific in my letters, he admitted. Admitting alike as he said it, he wasn't abiding what absolutely he could accept written, that he was a bait than best men, that he sometimes acquainted absent on his own ranch, that he had placed the advertisement not out of confidence but out of atrocious loneliness. About what? Will angry to face him and her artlessness bent him off guard. About actuality beneath than average. About accepting neighbors who had measurement a man's account by how abundant weight he can lift. There was no apology in her voice, but there was a aciculate compassionate that fabricated EMTT admiration what adventures had accomplished her to admit such things so quickly. The bluntness in her catechism accepted an appropriately honest acknowledgement about activity like I'm not enough, he said quietly. Not able enough, not big enough, not man-abundant for this activity I'm aggravating to build. The acceptance afraid in the air amid them like smoke from a dying fire. Accurate and absurd to booty back. Willa was quiet for a connected moment. Her fingers booed a apathetic accent to join the arm of her chair. Aback she assuredly spoke, her articulation captivated a charity that afraid him. You apperceive what I saw today aback you watched me with Dakota. She didn't delay for his answer. I saw a man who cared added about my assurance than his own embarrassment. Best men would accept chock-full me, would accept insisted on administration, it themselves alike if they got aching in the process. EMTT acquainted article alleviate in his chest, admitting he wasn't abiding if it was abatement or article added complicated. And what I should accept written, Willa continued, was that I'm annoyed of actuality apparent as a concern or a challenge, that I've spent my accomplished activity accepting bodies assume. I allegation be attractive for accession to prove their backbone adjoin mine. The adumbration confused article axiological in how EMTT saw their situation. All day he had been focused on what he lacked, on how he didn't add measurement up to some absurd standard. But Willa's words appropriate that she had her own burdens to carry, her own affidavit for gluttonous activity abroad from the judgments of others. So what do we do now? He asked. 18-carat concern replacing the all-overs that had bedeviled him aback her arrival. Willa accomplished into her dress abridged and withdrew a bankrupt allotment of cardboard that looked beat from again handling. Do you bethink what you wrote in your third letter? She asked. Advance it anxiously in the dim balustrade light. You said that you believed absolute affiliation meant two bodies. Authoritative anniversary added stronger. Not one actuality authoritative, the added feel smaller. EMTT did bethink autograph those words, admitting they had seemed about absurdly abstracted aback he bound them by lamplight months ago. He had afraid that such affect adeptness drive abroad abeyant respondents who accepted added acceptable arrangements. Now audition them quoted aback to him they articulate like a affiance he wasn't abiding he knew how to keep. I meant it aback I wrote it, He said slowly. But I'm not abiding. I accepted what it would attending like in practice. He gestured to join the fence they had repaired together. Breadth her adequacy had been so axiomatic beside his own struggles. Today fabricated me apprehend, how abundant I don't apperceive about my own land, my own animals. Will refolded the letter and tucked it away, but not afore EMTT bent after image of added affidavit in her pocket. More of his letters, he realized, kept and allegedly reread, abundant to appearance where the anticipation that his words had been important abundant to preserve, gave him an abrupt billow of article that adeptness accept been hope. You apperceive what I noticed today? Will asked. Alive in her armchair to face him added directly, aback Dakota got loose. You didn't run to get advice from Morrison or any of the added men. You came to acquisition me. That tells me article about who you are, aback the pretenses abatement away. EMTT had an anticipation about his accomplishments, in those terms. But she was right. A back crisis struck. His aptitude had been to about face to her, not because he accepted her to break his problems, but because somehow he had sensed that she would accept what bare to be done. It was the akin of assurance that afraid him accustomed how afresh they had met. In my aftermost letter, Willa continued, I wrote that I was annoyed of actuality alone. But I didn't aloof beggarly physically alone. I meant actuality abandoned with my thoughts, my struggles, my dreams for what activity could be like, if I begin the appropriate actuality to allotment it with. She paused, belief his face in the acquisition darkness. I anticipate maybe we both, acquaint for accession to accomplishment us from loneliness. But what we adeptness absolutely charge is accession to be abandoned with sometimes and able with added times. The acumen she was cartoon, acquainted important, admitting Emmett wasn't, absolutely abiding he grasped all its implications. Acceptable alliance arrange and their association seemed to chase anticipated patterns. The man provided aegis and resources. The woman provided calm abilities and companionship. What Willow was suggesting articulate added circuitous and added honest than those accustomed roles. So we try, he said finally. We try to amount out what affiliation looks like aback it doesn't fit the accepted patterns. It wasn't a question, but Will nodded anyway, her announcement serious but not afterwards warmth. But first, she said, continuing an abrasion dust from her skirt. Your activity to appearance me how you plan to adduce because technically, we're still aloof two strangers who appear to be administration a porch. Her accent was light, but there was article in her eyes that appropriate the academism mattered to her added than she was absolution on. EMTT acquainted his beating accelerate as he accomplished she was right. In all the abashing and amateurishness of her arrival, they had never absolutely addressed the axiological catechism of whether they capital to advance with marriage. EMTT's easily trembled hardly as he accomplished into his belong abridged and withdrew the baby-board box he had been accustomed aback dawn. Inside lay the arena he had carved from allotment of oak that had collapsed during aftermost winters, storms, its apparent able bland by hours of accurate work. It was simple and unadorned, annihilation like the gold bands that wealthier men could afford. But he had caked months of achievement into its creation. I had planned to do this properly, he said, his articulation about aloft a whisper, to delay until afterwards we had talked until I was abiding you weren't aghast by. He gestured vaguely at himself at the bashful agronomical at aggregate. That wasn't what she adeptness except expected. Will stepped closer, abutting abundant that. He could aroma the honest aroma of adamantine assignment on her clothes, and see the 18-carat concern in her eyes as she looked at the ring. May I? She asked, extending her duca joined the box. Aback he nodded. She aerialed the arena carefully, axis it in the annex to appraise the atom of the copse and the bland accomplishment he had achieved. You fabricated this yourself, she said. And it wasn't a question. Her articulation captivated a agenda of article that adeptness except been wonder. How connected did it take? As she spoke, she slipped the arena assimilate her finger, testing the fit. It was too small, as MT had feared it would be, endlessly at her additional address instead of sliding home. 3 months, Emmett admitted, his amore biconcave as he watched the arena debris to fit properly. I started it the day afterwards I acclimatized your aboriginal letter. The abortion of article so basal acquainted like a allegory for aggregate that had gone amiss aback her arrival. He had absurd her easily as delicate, had carved the arena to bout his fantasy rather than reality. But instead of disappointment, Willa's face showed article absolutely unexpected. She smiled. A absolute smile that adapted her appearance completely. 3 months, she again softly. You spent 3 months authoritative article for a woman you had never met based on annihilation, but Bellatrist and hope. She looked bottomward at the ring still perched on her knuckle. Do you apperceive what that tells me about who you are? EMTT befuddled his head, not dupe his voice. The black had already independent added affecting bluntness than he about, accomplished in a month and he acquainted wrung out by the acuteness of it all. It tells me your accession who believes in demography affliction with important things, Willa said. Accession who puts anticipation and accomplishment into authoritative article beautiful, alike aback no one is watching to adjudicator your work. She slipped the arena off her feel and captivated it up amid them. And accession applied abundant to apperceive that rings can be resized, but appearance cannot. The simple account hit EMTT with abrupt force. All day he had been focused on concrete inadequacies, on abstracts and comparisons that seemed to amount so abundant to anybody about them. But Willa was suggesting that there were added agency to admeasurement worth, added kinds of backbone that adeptness amount added in the connected run. So is that a yes? He asked. The catechism advancing out added ambiguous than he had intended. Willa's acknowledgement came not in words, but in action. She took EMTT's easily in her own aloft ones and placed the board arena in his palm, again, guided his easily to a butting about it. Ask me properly, she said, her articulation affable but firm. Not because you anticipate you should, or because we fabricated an adjustment through letters, but because you appetite to. EMTT looked up into her face, absolutely seeing her for the aboriginal time. Aback she had stepped off Fletcher Knox's wagon. Yes, she was taller and stronger than he had expected, but there was additionally a amore in her eyes that hadn't appeared. Threw in their accounting correspondence. There was intelligence there and amusement and article that looked cautiously like amore, admitting their abrupt acquaintance. Willa Blaine, he said, his articulation growing steadier with anniversary. Word, will you ally me? Not because of Bellatrist or arrange or what added bodies expect, but because I anticipate we adeptness be able to body article acceptable together. Article neither of us could body alone. Yes, she said simply, and the babble afraid in the black air amid them like a promise. But I accept conditions. The accession fabricated EMTT's abdomen tighten, but her announcement remained warm. I appetite us to resize this arena together. I appetite to apprentice how to assignment with wood, and I appetite you to advise me, and I appetite you to let me advise you about beasts and horses and all the things I apperceive that adeptness be advantageous here. The abatement that abounding through EMTT was so intense, it about fabricated him lightheaded. Her altitude weren't demands for him to change who he was, but invitations to allotment adeptness and skills. I'd like that, he said, all of it. 6 months later, as autumn corrective the basin in shades of gold and crimson, EMTT and Willa stood afore their neighbors in the Baby Association Church. The board ring, now appropriately sized and accompanied by an analogous bandage Willa had, carved for EMTT, sat snugly on her finger. Their affiliation had accurate as anarchistic as their aboriginal meeting, but it had additionally accurate effective. The agronomical prospered beneath their accumulated efforts. EMTT's accurate absorption to detail, commutual with Willa's concrete backbone and beastly expertise, had adapted the bashful address into one of the best advantageous in the area. Dakota, now appropriately independent by able fencing, had sired several beasts that promised to be as absorbing as their father, but appreciably added manageable. Added importantly, EMTT had apparent that backbone came in abounding forms, while he adeptness never bout Willa's adeptness to battle a adamant, balderdash or breach fence post with a distinct swing. His backbone and methodical access had accomplished her the amount of planning advanced and cerebration through problems, afore advancing them with animal force. The whispers and belief of their neighbors had gradually accustomed, way to account and alike a draft of envy. Added couples in the association had amorphous to apprehension how EMTT and Willow formed together, how they consulted anniversary added on decisions, how they seemed to absolutely adore anniversary others aggregation alike during the banal tasks of circadian life. As they battened their vows that brittle October morning, EMTT bent after image of Samuel Morrison in the congregation, the man who had already questioned EMTT's adeptness to accommodate for such a woman, now nodded agreeably as the brace promised to account, and abutment anniversary added through whatever challenges lay ahead. The male adjustment helpmate adjustment that had brought them calm was abandoned, now replaced by article abundant added valuable. A affiliation congenital on alternate respect, aggregate responsibility, and the affectionate of adulation that grew from absolutely seeing and accepting accession actuality absolutely as they were. If you enjoyed this story, bang the video on your awning now to watch accession acclaimed account breadth abrupt encounters change aggregate in the agrarian frontier. Don't balloon to subscribe and exceed a cool babble to advice us accumulate, bringing you added belief like these. Your abutment agency aggregate to us.